Good afternoon, parents. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we have the honor to have with us a very special guest, Dr. Marilyn Huffman, who is an expert in false memories and suggestibility. She currently is an expert witness in court that handling cases that dealing with false allegation and things like that. And as parents, as targeted parents, you are all very familiar with the situation where you are being falsely accused for abuse, sometimes very serious crimes, including sexual abuse of your children, and your children are being involved as witness, being recalled. Your children have been brainwashed to testify against you. And this is a very serious situation. We are not just talking about the damages to the children, the struggle that you have. So defending yourself is so critical. And for the professionals that involved in this type of situation, being able to detect and being able to figure out where the truth is so critical to everybody's involved here. So anyway, thank you so much for being a part of this. When you are here, please help us share. Please like the video and share. My name is Petra Dieter from the VictimToHero Institute. So Dr. Marilyn Huffman have been a professor for a number of years in many universities, over Tennessee, Georgia. I even forgot, like you have so many places that you have worked in. And then recently she has a book. She's a co-author of a book that's coming out, I think, next month. Is that right, Dr. Huffman?
It's a book chapter.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the book is called The Litigator's Guide to Forensic Medicine, Psychiatry and Psychology, and her chapters is on false memory and suggestibility. And one of the author of this book is Dr. Lorandos, that if you have been my audience for some time, you are familiar with him. He's an amazing expert in this field. So I'm so honored, Dr. Huffman, and thank you for being here. And also, Dr. Lorandos actually was the one that helped connecting us. I really wanted to talk to her, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Lorandos for connecting us. So thank you so much for being here. So I really and Bernard, I can see your comment. Hi, thank you so much. Parents, feel free to post your question and your comments, and we're going to try to pick up as many as we can. As always, I'm going to apologize in advance that sometimes we may not be able to pick up everybody's question because sometimes it scrolls past too fast, and we also have limited amount of time. But anyway, so we're going to go into this. So let's talk about false memories and suggestibility and the context that we are talking about today specifically is about litigation in court, right? Trying to detect what's going on. So how do false memory and how do false memory are created?
So I think the first thing that you need to understand is that a child's reporting one of three things when they're in the courtroom. We hope that they're reporting the truth, which is something that they believe to have happened and corresponds with reality. They could be reporting a lie, which is something that they know didn't happen, but they report anyway. But the third and probably the most dangerous, and what we really are focusing on, is a false belief. So this is something that does not correspond to reality, but the child earnestly believes to have happened. So I believe, I watched the interview that you did with Dr. Loftus, and one thing that she emphasized was that these children that have false beliefs, they earnestly believe these things to have happened. So they're not going to have any detection of lying. They're going to show all the cues. So even my master's thesis was we pulled the videos that we had done from a suggestibility study, the quote mousetrap study, which we'll talk about at some point. But we had false belief narratives that we transcribed and sent to international experts that said that they could tell the difference in whether a child was telling the truth or whether they were lying based on the transcripts. And they actually could not tell the difference in the true accounts and the false beliefs, that they were so similar with the amount of detail and all of that. So what we really want to avoid in the courtroom is having a child telling us a false narrative, something that they earnestly believe to have happened, but does not correspond to reality. So I do have some cases as an expert witness where the child just witnesses a crime against someone else, but most of the time it's a situation where the child is the victim. And so most of my cases, I've been involved in some custody. Most of the time it's criminal charges. So the stakes are very high. And I don't come in to say whether a child is telling the truth or not. I don't believe any expert can do that. My role is as an educator. I come in to, I'm just another piece of the puzzle to educate the jury on factors that may be affecting this particular child's testimony based on how the research applies in that case. So I think it's important to understand how those false memories are going to look differently in the courtroom. You know, how they might look different than lies, but they're really going to very much mirror a true account.
Yeah, and actually that's the most challenging and the most relevant really for our audience today, is because the targeted parents, they themselves know that this is not the truth. They did not abuse their children. And yet the children is so convincingly giving this narrative that, you know, they were sexually or physically abused or neglected. And so this is exactly the like out of those three scenarios, the scenario where the children have false memory is the one that most really relevant to our audience. So thank you. And Maura, hi, Miranda, and I think there's Karina, Catherine, Bravery. Thank you so much, you guys. We're gonna try to pick up your question. Those are all actually, yeah, Mara's especially the question. I saw your question, so I'm gonna try to pick up on these, but let's just focus on this first. And it's so critical. And just like Dr. Loftus, and if you guys haven't seen that interview that we did with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, also about false memory and distorted memory, was very critical. So this experiment is very famous. The mousetrap experiment is so famous, and when you see it, it's shocking. So I think for the audience that not familiar with this, let's talk about this before we go on so that they understand what you were talking about.
So when I arrived at Cornell in my early 20s, it was the early 80s or early 90s. And we had just had a wave of all the daycare abuse cases. And so the question was, why would children come up with a completely false story of something that had never happened? So the first research that we designed when I was at Cornell ended up being this famous mousetrap study, because there's so many misperceptions and myths out there. That's one reason I'm needed in the courtroom, is to really challenge some of these myths. So a current belief at the time was children only would come up with suggestive stories and narratives if they had been asked a lot of leading questions with pressure. So the mousetrap study, we had children that we had 10 events on index cards, and they were shuffled and the children picked them out, so they were random. 2 of the events were true. When we got parental consent, we had asked them for 2 recent family vacations, significant things, birthday parties, things that the children had experienced. So each child had 10 cards, 8 of which were false events, things we made up and verified with the parents had not happened, and then 2 of them were true. So the classic false were, you went on a hot air balloon ride with your nursery school class, you got your finger caught in a mousetrap and had to go to the hospital, you got on a bus with a lady who had an alligator, but the mousetrap really became the most famous because there's one boy who, well, the overall results were very surprising. So merely asking these kids once a week for 10 weeks if these events had happened. So all we asked was, did you go on a hot air balloon ride with your nursery school class? And then whatever answer they gave us, we might follow up with general open-ended questions. But the mousetrap, one boy in particular came up with a very elaborate narrative. So here we have an example of a completely false event. So before we had believed, just like the stop sign studies, the yield signs with Dr. Loftus, that we can tweak facts, pieces of a false narrative, but children won't be suggestible about completely, made up events. Well, and then of course, Dr. Loftus's work also showed, Lost in a Mall and some of those things that full narratives could be suggested. So what we found is that merely asking children if these things happen created false beliefs. And some to where even when children were told this didn't happen, the children maintained the fact that these events happen.
Yeah,
So
I just want to clarify a little bit. So this boy, he knew that he never stepped into the mousetrap, but he came up with this elaborate description of how he went down to the basement and the mousetrap caught him and he ended up in the hospital. And it's very detailed and specific and elaborated. So for something that never happened, he knew that it didn't happen. He agreed that it did not happen. The parents confirmed that this didn't happen. And yet the boy came up with this story and eventually truly believed that this has happened within this period of 10 weeks. And you could watch the video interviews and how he just, and without a lot of, there's no leading question to feed this boy to believe this. It's simply, like you said, just saying, did this happen? And it started from a point where he said it didn't, to the next thing you know, very quickly it became, yeah, I went in the hospital and all this happened. And I think he even said that he had ice cream after they went to the hospital or something, like some very elaborated details. Yeah, please go on. Sorry.
yes, so in the last couple years, I'd say in the last 10 years, I have been more and more focused and interested on the research on the roles of parents. And we know that parents, Deb Poole's early work really shows that parents asking children about events is very impactful on them. And that when parents are given misleading information about what, Mr. Science, a fictitious character, did in their room, what experiments he did, when parents are given wrong information, that comes out in when the children are re-interviewed about what Mr. Science did. But with Colin, he was actually interviewed on 2020 by John Stossel. And the night before, maybe earlier that day, he was told by his parents, this did not happen. So despite parental pressure, the other side, I believe, and this was years ago in the interview with John Stossel, Colin even tells John, my parents say it didn't happen, but I know it did. But here you have a little boy whose elaborate story was like, dad was putting wood in the fire, the wood burner downstairs. My brother pushed me into the wood stack. My finger got caught in a mousetrap. We were fighting over, and he had, which action figure they were fighting over. So yeah, we were very surprised. I thought children would have to be asked leading questions over and over. I was very surprised at the results, that merely asking if something happened. But, that's also, that can lead to a myth that kids have to be interviewed repeatedly, being asked something over time. Sometimes merely one interview can be so highly suggestive, children will form false beliefs. So it doesn't have to be repeatedly over time.
Yeah, and the problem is that once the children has formed this belief, even if you, let's say, do test lie detective tests, it's undetectable, because as far as children concerned, this is the truth. So when you're looking at this child and trying to get the truth out of this child, you can't. This is as real as it is to this child, right? So what do you do? How do you forensically, how do you detect the lies, the false narrative versus the truth?
Well, you can't. That's the key. You can't detect the difference. So what you have to do is all along, ever since from the first time an allegation is made or information comes out that a child is a witness to something, you do all you can to protect that memory all the way along. So that when a child is before the jury, you're able to say, safeguards were put in place. So the Child Advocacy Center, one of their extended forensic protocols would be to talk to the parents and say, please do not discuss this with your child. If they bring it up, you can listen. Don't ask follow-up questions. Let us do that. So what we hope is that when a child makes an allegation, there's very minimal interviews by anyone before the child gets to a child advocacy center or someone that is trained in these. Most of the time, I mean, in the last 20 years, pretty much all of the interviews are coming out of a child advocacy center. Those interviewers are so specifically trained to know how to conduct these interviews that is kind of our golden egg. That's what we want, to be able to trust the information of what the child is saying. So our naturally occurring conversations with children tend to be very directed, they tend to be very leading, and it really goes against every grain of how we speak with children to not ask leading questions and specific questions and to lead them through a discussion. And that's what these interviewers are trained to do. They are trained, you set up ground rules, you build rapport, you ask as many open-ended questions and get more and more and more information until then you can ask specific questions once you've exhausted everything that you can get from open-ended questions.
I see. So, so you need to be able to protect the child, and then hope that the child is only being interviewed by somebody is trained. So, what happened in the situation, particularly with parental alienation, that you have a malicious alienator who is out there to determine to brainwash the child? So, will just probably repeating over and over, and probably even have incentive to, maybe there's prize, or something might be subtle, like loving, showing loving to the child if the child follows this false narrative. How do we deal with that kind of situation?
I used to not get involved in any cases that involved custody issues because they just are so unkind, obviously, to say it mildly. And it just seems like, for lack of a better word, kind of a trump card, that if you're battling things out and an allegation is brought against, and I've been surprised in the last 5 to 10 years how many mothers are being accused of inappropriate behavior, like sexualized behavior with sons. But typically, from what I've seen, it is the father who's falsely accused. And when there's an allegation that comes out, obviously, like, they quote need to protect the child, so he has to have supervised visits if he has visits at all. So in the cases that I'm involved in, a lot of these become criminal charges, and it will take anywhere from 2 to 3 years on average from the cases I've been involved in, from the time of an allegation till we get to trial or a plea or the charges are dropped. So for that whole time, when you're in the middle of a custody battle and there's an allegation, true or false, on the table, to quote protect the child, they can't have any contact with that parent. And that is, I mean, that's where the problems come, I think. And whether it's malicious or not, there are messages being sent to the child about that parent. So Michelle Leishman, who also worked under Steve Cece at Cornell, about the time we were doing a mousetrap study, she was doing what's known as the Sam Stone study, where she was looking at stereotypes and whether negative. So Sam Stone was a fictitious character, came into the school, the preschool, played with kids, and then left. And then after he was gone, there was like a page ripped out of a book, and I think it was a doll's head had come off. So the question was, did Sam Stone do these things? And the children who had had negative stereotypes of Sam Stone, so for example, the teacher for weeks before had been like, oh, I've got this friend and he's so clumsy. He came over, he knocked this plant over. And, just kind of this negative stereotype about Sam Stone. Those kids were more likely to say he had ripped the book and taken the head off the doll, or I think it was decapitated. But the kids who didn't have that suggestive information of, the stereotype of him, were not as likely to say it. And again, we're dealing with preschoolers, so we may not be able to generalize to older children. Then children who were interviewed suggestively about Samstone doing these things, they obviously were more likely to comply with suggestion. And the children who both had the negative stereotype and the suggestive questions, they were the highest suggestibility group, as you would expect. So the question is, when we're dealing with parental alienation, are we dealing with negative stereotypes? Well, I have known very few friends going through a divorce who have been able to really watch what they say about that other parent and not disparaging them and not saying anything negative. I mean, it's such a horrible situation for both parents to have to be in parenting through all of that negotiation and you know, taking a family apart essentially. So I mean, I think that is what I see, is that one parent is obviously the contact and the access to even talking to the children is so dramatically changed when there is an allegation involved.
So, with the cases that you have been involved, and I mean, without giving the actual details, could you give us some possible, maybe an example about, like, maybe generalize it enough so it's not giving information away, but is there a particular, especially if there's a case that already finished, maybe that's easier, where you could give us an example of what are some of the factor of the case that where it's proven that the child, or not proven, but let's just say the jury believes that the child is not a credible witness.
So situations where the jury decides that the child's not a credible witness. We have done some with an expert, David Ross, out of Chattanooga. We've done some mock juries where we're able to get that information from the jurors as they leave. But I don't think that it's able to piece apart what is involved in, quote unquote, discrediting a child. So sometimes I will have attorneys that want to have a competency hearing as to whether the child is competent to testify based on their age. But I have found judges to be extremely conservative, where they are going to let the jury hear the child's testimony and make that decision. So pretty much what I've seen is, you know, the earliest episodic memories that children are able to verbalize is probably about 2.5. So we don't see interviews being done with kids younger than 3. And then, of course, by the time they get on the stand, they're probably 5 or 6 and are at a whole different developmental level. So just as a side note, I often remind the jury to consider that the child developmentally where they were when the alleged event happened and not where they are now when they're taking the stand. Because 2 or 3 years in childhood makes a very big difference.
Right.
And sometimes attorneys will play, the prosecutor will play the original interview with them, the child advocacy interview, and that helps because then they can see the younger child. So, but the factors that we want the jury to consider that may discredit the witness will be there's social factors, there's cognitive factors that both come into play. And then of course there's interview factors, which are going to overlap between those. So, and I have lists of those different things, and we can certainly touch on some of them. But sometimes we want the jury, and again, I can't speak as what a juror decides and what they base it on. Another thing that I'm always very clear about is that I'm one piece of the puzzle. I come in and testify for a couple hours, and sometimes these cases go on for 4 days, 3 weeks, depending on the number of witnesses and the amount of information, the number of experts on it. So I'm just one piece of it. So I'm just there to educate the jury, to deal with misperceptions, to point out things that they may not know about how children's memory works. So things that jurors cue into from research, we know that they're going to consider how many times the child was interviewed, that if, you know, I develop a timeline at the beginning of every case. Who all did they speak with before that CAC interview? So, you know, hypothetically, you'll see a child make a disclosure to a babysitter, a mother, a grandparent. Then they, you know, will bring in the stepdad who also talks to them. then they'll go confront the dad with the child. Then, the police will come, possibly interview. If the allegations made at school, the child, discloses to a teacher, sometimes after sex education exposure about if you've had a bad touch. We have these good touch, bad touch conversations, depending on what the curriculum is in elementary school. Sometimes allegations will come out after that. The children will say, I didn't realize this was a bad touch. Then they're interviewed by the school, the teacher, the guidance counselor, the counselor at the school. They might be interviewed by someone else. The police or social services might come and interview them, all before they get to a CAC. So mind you, all of those people are not recording their interviews. They're not following a protocol. We don't know what kind of questions were asked. So even by the time they get in front of a CAC interviewer, we may be dealing with who knows what by that point. So one thing we do know from juror exit interviews that really hits home with them is a term called Humpty Dumpty, the Humpty Dumpty effect. So when a child has been interviewed repeatedly or misled, or in kind of a complicated situation where they've discussed this with siblings, sometimes they're interviewed with the sibling in the room. If the memory is scrambled, so to speak, like an egg, like Humpty Dumpty, we can't put it back together. All we can tell the jury is here are the pieces that could cause this memory to not be reliable. So I do not talk about the validity of a memory. There's a difference in validity and reliability. So only the judge and jury are deciding whether it's valid. And reliability is, can it be relied upon? Like, is this what originally happened? I mean, or can we trust what the child's saying, not the validity of it?
I understand, but that is so critical though, right? Because the general uneducated, I would say, the word, I guess, jury or the public perception is that a child doesn't lie. You take the child words as it is. That's the general perception of the public. Oh, if a child says something, clearly that must be the truth. So it's so critical to bring in that knowledge and that awareness that there's a lot of factors that could be involved, and it's so critical to have that education for the jury who have determined this such a high stakes situation. So that's so critical. And you mentioned that you have a list of factors. What are some of those?
So in the social category would be parental pressure. So if they feel pressures, like you mentioned, even not maliciously, messages can be sent. So a child will be like, if you don't say that this happened, are you sure this happened? Because if it happened, you don't ever have to go to your dad's house again. So there's messages being sent by parental pressure. Parental pressure also, if the child originally said something to the mom and then mom is present when they're interviewed, or mom takes them to the interview, or even the interviewer says, I talked to your mom beforehand, I want you to tell me what happened. There's pressure to comply with what they've previously said, but there's also pressure directly from a parent some of the time, even if it's not malicious or that they know that they're doing it. Another social aspect is the child's relationship to the perpetrator. If it's a parent, I know y'all are focused on parental alienation, but it also could be a grandparent, a neighbor, a family friend. I've had situations where mother has different boyfriends rotating in and out of the house. There's social pressure to comply with what they previously said. Like I said, pressure from others also making an allegation. I'll often have siblings where one will say something happened and then the other, and sometimes in their interviews, they're even like, so-and-so said, I know that my sister said this and this is what happened to me. So you see signs that they've discussed it with each other. You also have siblings recall, like I said, of a similar abuse situation that can confuse their own memory, stereotypes like we talked about of the alleged perpetrator, and then contamination, like I mentioned, of being interviewed with someone else, even being interviewed with the parent, but also I'll have situations where they're interviewed with another child or another alleged victim. Also, I rarely see this anymore. I only see this when it's a police interview. CACs are not doing this, where the child is interviewed by more than one adult. So that's a very pressurized situation when a child is being interviewed by, two detectives or a social worker and a detective, two adults, because there's that feeling like they're an authority, they already know what happened. So those are problematic. As far as the cognitive factors, which is just kind of the mental of what the child knows and doesn't know, previously experienced similar events can be confusing. So for example, we have script knowledge. So when a child is asked to contextually reinstate themselves in the house, we don't want jurors to be confused where the child is able to completely describe the trailer where the grandparent, where the dad, whoever lives. It'll be like, there was this color of a sofa and this TV and this show was playing on TV, because all of those are contextual cues that may be true. That may be a very typical scripted event of what happens, but then the touching and the sexual abuse allegation is added into that. It's kind of grafted into that typical script of what might happen. So they could also, another cognitive factor is exposure to other sexual information. So I'm also looking for, and interviewers were often asked, is the pornography in the house? Have you ever seen videos? You'd be surprised how many devices they have exposure to that aren't locked down, that may have porn on them. Friends at school. When we deal with kind of those early teens that are not interviewed until much later, we're also dealing with personal sexual experience with boyfriends or girlfriends. Other cognitive factors are obviously the discussions with parents and siblings, but you also have to watch these quote informal interviews. That's discussions with anyone else kind of in that circle around the child, extended families, aunts, grandmothers. I've had several situations where mom or aunt were abused as children, and then they are hyper vigilant. They're asking a lot of questions. They're trying to see if the child was abused. I've had cases where there are certain books on sexual abuse that they're reading with the child to try to determine. There's children's books out there that help kids in therapy who've been abused, and these books are being read with children who've never made an allegation. And then, not surprisingly, we have allegations. So those are more cognitive factors, kind of the implanting of false information from these books. We also have an issue of a time delay. What is the delay between the alleged event and when an allegation is made? You'd be surprised sometimes what that is. So as far as being able to trust the memory, we want that gap to be as small as possible. I've had cases where an allegation is made, the child's at a CAC within 2 days with minimal discussions. I turn down probably about half of the cases that come across my desk. And one of the reasons I turn cases down is like, you don't have suggestibility factors at play here. You've got a very well done interview. I've turned down cases because I think the interview follows protocols and is well done. There's not a time gap. There's not a highly pressurized social environment where one parent is trying to, have negative views or stereotypes of the other one. So, and then other cognitive factors might be an investigation bias. Often when one person comes on the radar, when an allegation is made, that's what they pursue. You don't see them pursuing any alternative hypotheses. Who else had access to the child, especially if there were multiple people living there? I've had cases where multiple families are living together, sometimes with other boys in the home, non-relatives, teenage boys, and never is a question asked about those other people. And obviously, like you said, I'm talking very generally. I've been doing this for over 20 years. So these are bits and pieces of what I've seen. The information is not coming from just one case. We also are I'm seeing a big impact possibly, or making sure jurors see it when kids have been in therapy repeatedly before their courtroom testimony or before their forensic interview. The forensic goals are so different than the therapeutic goals. I've even had a therapist tell me before, they don't care what corresponds to reality. They only are responsible for what the child perceives as reality. So if the child perceives that they were abused, that's what they have to work with. That's what they need to work with, is the child having this belief that they're abused and helping them work through being a child victim of whatever kind of abuse or a child witness of abuse.
And that is so scary, right? Because while it makes sense that as far as the impact of the child concerned, whether it's real or not, if the child believes that the child's abused, they need to be healed from that. So as far as it makes sense from therapeutic standpoint, but it's also dangerous because the therapist sort of standard mode of treatment is that you support the victim. So if the victim said I was abused, it would be like, oh, I'm so sorry you're abused. You kind of almost enforcing that. And if it's a false narrative, they are actually supporting this false narrative, right? So even though they're trying to do the right thing, it's actually can be really dangerous here.
Well, and also, what therapist does a parent decide to take the child to? There are certain therapists that specialize with abused children. And so if a child goes to that and the therapist already has a paradigm that children coming to them are abused, that again could be highly problematic.
Right. So this is similar to the investigative bias that you're talking about, where you have an investigator that's come in with this concept that, oh, they're abused and they are out there to prove that it exists. Right.
Right.
Okay, so I wanted to quickly check the question. There's so many questions, and I now it does this to me all the time. It just always scroll past. Let's see if there's a way for me to look at it a little bit, because there's a lot of, oh yay, I think, oh no, not okay. Okay, is it better to not go to court, or should you not fight? Taking the child's best interest at heart. So I guess this question is about, how do you think the investigation process, what is the impact on the children? Would you want to comment on that?
I don't. I think that's a very clinical question. Most of the cases, the parent's forced to go to court because there's criminal investigations. It's not a choice. I mean, they are literally looking at 20 plus years in jail. They don't have a choice of whether to go to court or not. I just think that everyone needs to be very careful when allegations are made and what preempted it, what happened. But I mean, if a child is abused, obviously that needs to be pursued.
So I think the
I think that's
takeaway,
hard.
yeah, I think the takeaway that I have so far is that if you are a targeted parent and you get into a situation where you're being falsely accused, what you need to do is, as quickly as possible, protect the child and get the child to be heard by the professional, interviewed by professional as quickly as possible, because that shortens the period of time where the child, from supposed event to the and also it's also reduce the amount of time for coaching and brainwashing. So yeah, as quickly as possible, as soon as you get accused, instead of just kind of ignoring it and go, oh, this is not true, I'm just not going to do anything about it. And before it go to court, if you start hearing something, then as quickly as possible, getting the child to a professional child advocate interview as possible, because then later, if the child being interviewed, it may be easier to show the discrepancy between the interviews. Is that
Okay, but see, that's not always possible, right? Because social service gets involved and they're taking or having the non-accused parent take the child to this interview. And the interviewer meets with whoever brings them before they interview the child. So they're going in there with biased information. So if you can get a blind interview at a child advocacy center, I've even had people take kids to different CACs where they take them to another part of the state. They get them to a private clinician who's trained in forensic interviewing to get a good interview. The problem is that those interviewers can sometimes go in with biases as far as what happened based on the information from the parent. So I doubt that the allegation is going to be made first. to the alleged perpetrator, right? And if you're being accused of something, you're certainly not going to take the child to a CAC. So it's a fine line, because rarely is the alleged perpetrator able to get them to a non-biased interview. In practicality, we would love for that to happen, but it's not very often the case that they even have access to do that.
I understand, and that's a struggle, right? So as a victim of false allegation, what can you do here? What can we give the parents that can be helpful for them? That's the struggle that I have right now, is what can they do to help their case? Obviously, finding a way to educate the investigator and the jury is critical. Finding someone that, like you, who can come in and educate these people, obviously that's one of the key factors, but what else can they do?
I really don't know, because
Yeah,
it's a fast moving train. It's such a fast moving train. Once an allegation's made, that social services is moving it right to a CAC interview. Again, you don't know what information happens going in there. You don't know what information, they don't record that. They'll record the interview with the children most of the time now, but investigators, detectives, rarely do I see that they are interviewing. They're recording, they're rarely recording the interviews that they conduct with children before that CAC. So I
right.
think if you can get good legal counsel, if you can find someone to, educate the jury on this. I also think a good defense attorney, when there's cases that I'm not able to be involved with, sometimes I'll get involved just as a consultant and write the questions for cross-examination. So I've worked with amazing attorneys that just listening to the questions that they're asking on cross-examination, they were able to point out the protocol violations. They're able to point out the bias of the whole investigation just by cross-examining the person that interviewed the child, the police detective, the social worker, the principal of the school who first interviewed them, the mother, the grandmother, who all's interviewed them, and the fact that they can't reconstruct what exactly they said in those unrecorded interviews.
I see, I understand. Okay, so now we have to focus, because the child is really, you can't tell now because the child truly believes this. So instead of trying to reverse something in the child, we now have to look at this whole process that where the child end up here. Anything that going, so this now, in order to prove false allegation, you have to go in and look at all these elements that are coming along the way to the point that we are now, where the child accused of this allegation. I understand.
Right.
Okay, so now you go back and you go, okay, how long has this been, and who have been involved in this process, and what are some of the factors that you mentioned, like social factor, like parental pressure, or etc. Exposure to other pornography or things like that. So okay, I understand. Okay, so that's actually is also very important. That is such an important takeaway. So what about is there of influence? And I saw someone in the chat room ask this. How is it different in different age group for children? As a, how do they affect the children differently?
Early on in my work, it was all preschoolers. 3 to 6 year olds. Our work showed that those 3 or 4 year olds are so highly suggestible. Our 5 and 6 year olds is decreasing. And then we just assumed when we moved into childhood, kids are going to be able to be pretty accurate. But I actually have testified. I've had a lot of cases recently with adolescents. So, and I've even had a case with adults, who are going back and making allegations from 30 years before. Not saying that they were repressed memories. There was never a time when they didn't know that those things happened, according to them, but they're going all the way back 30 years to when they were teenagers and alleging something happened. So we are seeing suggestibility in the research at all ages. And of course, you look at Dr. Loftus's work, who started the whole thing rolling, right? I mean, she was finding it in adults. So across the lifespan, we're seeing it. I would say those 3 to 6-year-olds are our most suggestible little population. But with teenagers, when we move into middle childhood and teenagers, some studies are actually finding higher suggestibility because of picking up on all the social cues and wanting to please an interviewer, and they're picking up on all the nuances of what's involved if they say this or that. And anybody over time can come to believe something happened that actually didn't happen. So we are seeing it all over the lifespan. And on cross-examination, a lot of prosecutors will point that out to me, like, Dr. Huffman, I thought suggestibility was in early childhood, and we've got studies that show it is all the way through the lifespan.
Wow, that's really dangerous. Okay. Stephanie said, I agree with what you're saying, but it seems very prevalent in a toxic versus healthy parent high conflict situation. Yeah, it is very prevalent. The situation of false allegation. I assume that's what you're talking about, Stephanie. Molly said 9 out of 10 a parent capable of severe alienation has psychotic pathology and will break the child's psychological systems. They are breaking our children and creating a child's own psychotic pathology, and it's that simple. So I was one of those children. I was one of those children where I was told that my father, there's no actual abuse to me, but that my father was a monster. And I believed that. I never questioned that. And really it took 40 something years before I woke up that it was false. So yeah, it's the brainwashing can be very entrenched. Miranda said, perverse brains from denying cover up. I think that's a response to something that I missed. I'm sorry. Okay, Claudette said, if that memory isn't interrupted and they become an adult, do they ever stop believing it? Do they ever grow up and realize that it was actually a false memory? So this is a situation where there's no litigation involved, assumingly, and the child falsely believe in something, where the child was planted, there's a false memory implanted in the child. When they become an adult, is there a way for them to just suddenly by themselves become aware? Do you know of?
I think the literature is inconsistent on answering this. Some research shows that if a child is just left alone and not repeatedly interviewed and is not reinforced over time, that the memory will fade, right? That they'll come to realize that it didn't happen. But does that really ever happen? I mean, if you're in a situation where one parent is driving the other parent away, are those messages against the parent, the wrongly accused or whatever parent, do those messages ever go away? Not likely, unless you become distant from both of your parents. And then over time, really start unpacking or thinking through what did and didn't happen. So I don't know that there are a lot of situations where a child doesn't ever discuss it again after the initial allegations are made. Normally we're caught up in we're caught up in litigation. We've got a lot of things going. But some research does show that if the child is just left alone and doesn't discuss it, that the false memories may fade over time. But then I think there's studies that show the opposite, that there's no counter information or anything coming in. So whether you come back into relationship with the alleged perpetrator or not, or the parent that's been pushed away from you, that would be good to get a clinical psychologist to just talk about all that, the psychology of parental alienation. And I don't know if you've had any clinical psychologists on. I believe you
Yes.
either have them scheduled or you've already had them.
Right.
But really the psychology of what's happening, and is it creating PTSD? Like, what are but those are excellent clinical questions. And When I'm on the stand, I'm real clear to stay in my lane as far as what I can answer from research and what I can't. So
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much. So I do know a case where the mother accused the father of abuse. I believe it was sexual abuse. And then she ended up having custody because of that. And then she actually went and killed the father. Took the father to with some roommates, took the father to the desert in Arizona and left him out there, and they found his body a few years later. And so the child then actually went to court and testified against the mother. So the child actually woke up after the father was killed. The child actually stood by her father. Um, so I don't know, but obviously there's a huge factor there. Her father is now, gone. So anyway, so thank you. Okay, Stephanie asked, is there any this link to age? So I think we already addressed the question on age. Because I was told my daughter's therapist that is her age and she likes to get reaction from people. Is that true? Okay, so I don't know if people want to add something. We did discuss age, and yes, sometimes children do certain thing because they want to get a certain reaction, and yeah, I think that's something that you did address, especially teenagers, where maybe they try to please the people, or maybe because they think that the people know a certain version of the story, especially if they think that the detective is an authority, and if the detective said, I already talked to your mother, and if the mother have said certain things, or I already talked to your father or whatever, and then the child feel obligated to follow with whatever the version that the mother said, right? To it, so that's a form of trying to get certain reaction. Or do you want to add anything else to that?
I know that I had at least one situation where a child wanted attention, where there was attention on other children in the home and they weren't getting much attention, or they were kind of getting lost in the shuffle of a divorce situation, and it's a very reinforced behavior, right? You make an allegation and then all of a sudden you get to talk to all these people, you get to go to a place where they let you pick out a teddy bear. I mean, and I
You're
believe
the center of the attention, certainly.
right. So that certainly could be a motivation as well. And I don't see that often, but I do know there's at least one case where we brought that as an issue.
I see. And then what was the outcome of that case?
I don't remember.
Okay, thank you. No, thank you. Miranda said unresolved. Okay, I'm not sure what that was relating to. Debbie said, yep, mom was living with 3 guys plus my granddaughter slept with her 3 brothers. I guess, again, this is specific to something that I'm not quite sure what it is. Stephanie said, what you're sharing is very helpful and I truly appreciate you sharing. So thank you, Stephanie. Miranda says sociopaths have to present. I don't really understand. Molly said very few psychotherapists are trained to work with alienated children. How can we know what specialists to use? I think that's a good question. How do we know who would be the right kind of experts? Like somebody like you, for example, if somebody say I would be the right one to go in and testify regarding suggestibility or things like that, like how do we know that that's the right person?
I don't know, but I think what she's also asking about is psychotherapy. Who
Right.
can we trust to counsel our children who
Yeah.
aren't going to be biased
Yeah.
toward, one parent and another? And that's very difficult. And I would say that that's word of mouth, that's talking to people in the community, whether there's professors who are researching this in the area. That is a very difficult question. And maybe even talking to the therapist about whether they assume children are telling the truth, how do they help them work through an allegation. But again, the parent who's most likely taking them to therapy believes the abuse has happened. They're not still going to be with that alleged perpetrator. That communication, that contact is going to have been cut off. it's very tricky, but again, it would be word of mouth. It would be maybe talking to local professors who are working in this area about which therapist they trust. I know here in Atlanta, we have a therapist who her primary clinical, and she's an amazing expert witness as well, but she works in her clinical practice with wrongfully accused perpetrators, and they need therapy too, right? So that's been her focus and her work. And now post-pandemic, if we're even post-pandemic, I think we have a new wave of telemedicine where all of a sudden we realize we can do therapy, via Zoom. So it kind of opens the country up, right? To be doing therapy with people, nationwide, face to face, so to speak, through the computer.
Yeah, so location is less of a restrictive factor now, right? But is there any particular kind of qualification that perhaps we can look in? Is there a particular training that we could potentially look at someone, a therapist, and say, oh, this person is a little bit more knowledge than some others?
I don't, and that would be an answer for Doc Lorendo's or, someone else who's dealt a lot more with clinical psychologists, or one of your, maybe Dr. Burnett, he might be able to answer that. But you want to look at their training. I doubt they're going to be trained in forensic interviewing, but if any of them are, you will have therapy available through a child advocacy center some of the time. But again, are they biased or not? There's just going to be some very honest questions that you hope that they're answering honestly about their perspective on counseling. But again, there's such a disparity that the research is showing between therapeutic goals and forensic goals. So once you have a good forensic interview, then, therapy may or may not result in false information. So you really need a very solid, and it was interesting. I was reading, for a previous court case recently, I was writing an expert opinion, and some therapists or some prosecutors will realize that this child needs therapy and that that's putting the whole court case in jeopardy, right? That you don't know what's going to happen as a result of that. And that's okay, that they either won't prosecute, they realize that the needs of the child are going to trump, and that they've got to be in therapy for the allegation. And it means that what they say on the stand may not be reliable, and they're okay with that. So there's kind of this spectrum of, we believe everything they say. They're not going to say anything that doesn't happen to them. So even through therapy, we can trust what they say. I have a hard time, and it would be red flags, and I would point this out to the jury, where a child is in therapy for several sessions, still haven't made an allegation, and then all of a sudden we've got an abuse allegation and we're in the middle of therapy. So other misperceptions that are out there is that a child will not tell the truth initially, that they'll deny allegations, and that they have to be interviewed several times before they're going to admit to what actually happened to them. So, and that was based in Summit's work years ago, and he actually even came around to say, this wasn't an experimental study, it wasn't even field research. I just took a couple interviews with people and kind of explain this, but it had caused enough of a ball rolling that kids aren't going to disclose, and they're only going to disclose after time. So then you've got therapists who are like, it's okay that they're saying this didn't happen. I expect that. It's going to take me talking to them several times before they're going to admit what we already know has happened. So that's a huge problem when there's this belief that children have to be interviewed over and over before they're going to tell us what we know has already happened. The abuse
Actually, that is so helpful. That's so helpful to know, because actually we I've seen a lot of this situation with targeted parents is that they are perfect parents. They are being seen as good parent all along. The children have never complained, and then suddenly when the custody case heated up, suddenly it popped up an allegation about something happened 2 years ago. And the child might have been in therapy for several years and never once complained. So this is really good to know that is actually a red flag, that it's actually a good way to recognize that this is a false allegation. So thank you.
There again, the prosecutor is most likely going to put that therapist on the stand to talk about when the allegation was first made, right? And that's where a good defense attorney He's going to come in with all those cross-examination questions. Sometimes I think that it is good that you may not need an expert. You might have them calling enough people to take a part on cross-examination. So if you have an interviewer on the stand, and if you can show that they didn't follow protocols, if you can show that there are numerous therapy, and if you can show that they've, I mean, maybe when you're interviewing a therapist, you could ask how many of the children that you're interviewing make allegations of sexual abuse, and do they admit it right away, or do you think that they've got to be in several therapy sessions before there's enough rapport where they'll tell you what actually happened? Some of those kind of questions might be really helpful in picking a therapist for children. But I totally understand that kids need to be in therapy, because on cross-examination, they're like, Dr. Huffman, do you think that these children should not have access to counseling? I'm like, it's going to take 2 or 3 years before we even get through this litigation. Of course they need therapy, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be detriments on their memory because of all of these therapy and conversations. Therapists aren't trained, and they're not recording the interviews. So they will have like this many notes, sometimes 4 or 5 notes from an hour session with children. Now, is it purposefully vague because they know they're going to hit litigation because these children are alleging abuse? I don't know. That again is a question for a clinician, but the jury needs to consider that. And the research shows that interviewers cannot accurately reconstruct how an interview was conducted. Even when they're told, even when they're trained forensic interviewers who are told, you're going to recreate this from whatever notes right after, they recreate their notes of their interview as if they had asked more open-ended questions and not as many suggestive and leading and specific questions as they actually did. So the research shows they can't recreate it. And when they have this many notes and they've met with the child 15, 20 times, they really cannot argue that they know how the allegations were made, what was being asked, and all those things in therapy.
Wow. Wow, I'm shocked. I mean, what you just said about research show that they can't reconstruct, and when they're being asked to reconstruct, they make it seem like they're more open-ended and less suggestive to the children. That is so interesting. Thank you. Okay, so Molly, thank you for that question. Let's see, Steven said, my charges would drop, but I'm still fighting for custody. Yeah, that's very unfortunate situation with our parents, with our audience, is that the fight is just on and on forever. If it's not this, then it's that, and it just, and a lot of the time they file a false allegation as a tactic to just delay things, because the parents immediately lose custody, and then now it takes 2 years, and then they just drop the charge because they know they can't win, and then you can breathe for a moment, and then the next thing you know, they file another false allegation, and then you just in and out of court for in the meanwhile the children are brainwashed, and then they age out. It's a terrible situation. Okay, Debbie said,
If I can add one thing there, I've had attorneys be proactive in dealing with that situation, where they will have me write an expert opinion just to get it in the record once allegations have been dropped, because they're so tentative. They're like, well, they dropped these allegations, but are they going to come up with others? And sometimes by having an expert write an opinion that's submitted into the record can sometimes nip that in the bud. Because if you can find a local expert or an expert to come in and write up, here's what's going on. We've got all these conversations. We've already had, allegations dropped, which would have been their best chance at making an allegation, right? They would have pulled the one thing that they thought would have stuck. And obviously in some of these situations, the criminal allegations, if you can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, then everything else comes easily against that, right? The civil suits are almost a guarantee, because that's just a little more than 50, more likely than not. So sometimes they will pull the big trump card of criminal allegations, and if that sticks, then everything else is just kind of
exactly.
a given.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because the standard of proof for the civil case is much lower. It's a preponderance of evidence as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt. Yeah.
And the great thing is when parents will file, when the alienating parent or the non-accused parent files a civil suit before the criminal suit is finished. Because then you can look at the jury and say, look, they're suing for this much money before we're even finished with this. And so you kind of can really show motive. So excuse me, if you have any parents that are in that situation, look for those civil cases. That's a helpful thing if the civil cases are filed before the criminal is resolved.
So I have a case where a father was accused of abuse. Both the accusation was that he was violent to both the mother and the children, and so they went through this litigation, and then eventually the mother dropped the allegation and decided to go back to the father, like they got back together. So the mother wrote to court this testimony and get it notarized and submitted to court to close this case. And she wrote this long letter explaining that he was never abusive, and that when she wanted to get a divorce, she went to the lawyer, and the lawyer said, if you don't have any allegation of abuse, then I don't have anything for you. I can't. You need to come up with something. And then the lawyer then created, like she explained how the lawyers show her how to create the false allegation by triggering him, including like, oh, what is the most sensitive things to him? Oh, his mother? Then, call his mother a bitch and this and that in front of him. And, like, make sure that you say it when he's most tired, when he's most stressed out, and all this sort of thing. And then, so she wrote all this out and said, I made up this lie and all that kind of things, right? So she submitted that. And then later on, and then got back to him. Later on, they broke up again. She now went back to the same lawyer, and now they went back again with this whole false allegation that he's a predator and he's this and that. And so you mentioned that if you have an expert witness that writes something, like, is that the kind of situation that you're talking about? And how does it help?
Well, you can. You can do that, but if he's, especially if he's back under criminal investigation, I've been contacted. I know there was one case I was contacted, and the child hadn't even gone into a CAC interview yet. It was literally within hours of an allegation being made. They had heard of me. They called me. I think it was even on a Saturday. I said, send me everything you have. I'll get something written up, an affidavit of what information of what I see. My credentials will attach my vita. I'll say the factors I see. And the charges were dropped the next day. And this obviously isn't going to happen very often, but they were kind of like, we don't even have fun. Like, we hadn't even gotten funds to pay you out. I'm like, that's fine. It was well worth a couple hours of my time for this process to not even start. So when you're in the middle of it, I don't know when you bring an expert on. Some public defenders are able to hire experts. Some judges, some states are better able to do that, or more willing to do that. So
no, that's
again,
great. That's great. So
really
the earlier you
good.
can bring, the earlier you can bring someone in, the better. It seems
I
like.
think so. But if you can have a good defense attorney who really is able to do a lot on cross-examination, but there again, it's kind of up to the attorney whether they believe they need an expert. And my colleagues, I think, will be very honest as to whether they can contribute, whether the science is going to help or not. I think there'll be, I don't know anyone who's just kind of in it to take every case. Again, I turn down quite a few cases that come across my desk if I don't think the science is relevant, if I don't think there's, if I think there's a chance that something did happen to this child. I don't want to get involved, because then as more information comes in, I tell, it's more ethics on my side, but I just tell the attorneys, you don't want me on cross-examination if I think that something may have happened. Like, a good prosecutor is going to get that out of me. They're going to know the right questions to ask, and it will not help the case at all. Like, you really don't want me on the stand in that situation.
Thank you, thank you. So yeah, with this particular case that I just mentioned, eventually they actually someone interviewed the child, and the child been saying, you know, my dad is a predator, and then eventually, and these children was really young, so eventually they asked the child like, well, what is a predator? And the child said, well, I don't know. I guess it's like in the Lion King movie. And that's how he got himself clear, is because the child, it turned out that the child doesn't know what the child is saying, using words that the child themselves don't know what it means. But okay, so let's check out some more question. If we Stephen said, correct, you can't see your kid. Yeah, so when you're being falsely accused, that's unfortunately the situation, is that you lose contact with your children at that point. Okay, Devin said, what would be your preferred manner for an attorney to contact you regarding a potential consultation in connection with a criminal charges against a client?
When is the timing? What was the question? What was the
What would be your
beginning of the question?
preferred manner for an attorney to contact you?
Normally it's a phone call. Normally they'll email an expert. I mean, there's a lot of professors who won't do it, but you know, normally it's an email saying, here's kind of the situation, and then we'll talk about it. Initially, one thing that we want to get are school records, or there might be an individual education program, an IEP, where they might be talking about memory, concentration issues. You'll have social service records, you'll have therapy records that it's a hard time getting a hold of. So you want to have that CAC interview transcribed a lot of times, because like what I do is I go in and actually analyze all the questions. I look at how they were asked, I get examples of leading questions. I look at the number of open-ended questions and what's being what information is being elicited, if they do a practice narrative, and you know, what rapport was built, what questions were asked. So it's hard to do that just from a video. It's easier if you have a transcript. So a lot of times the attorney needs to be collecting information all along, and then, you know, giving the expert all the information that is available. And then that expert should be able to write a letter, especially if it's going to be a state funded case, the public defender, of here's the factors I see, and here's what I think the right to a fair trial would include an expert to deal with the myths, to educate the jury. There's misperceptions. The jury just needs to be educated so that they are dealing with the correct information on a child, middle childhood, you know, adolescent allegation. So, you know, they can get involved at any point. I've been called early in a case, and I've been called 2 weeks before trial when they realize that, you know, they probably need a suggestibility expert.
So do you have a website, or how do people reach you?
I don't, it's only word of mouth.
Okay.
I'm not publishing on any websites.
Yeah.
You know, you're welcome to put my contact information, my email on
So
the
I
web.
think what we do is that any parents that wanted to reach Dr. Huffman, you can reach out to us, and then we will forward your inquiries, because I don't want to put your email address out there to the public.
Okay.
But yeah, so anyone that wanted to reach her, let us know. Mary said, my ex used our children to lie to the police and had me falsely arrested and removed, to never seeing them again in 16 years, even after I was clear as innocent. Yeah, and the thing is, it's not just you, the parents, but the children, the trauma and the damage to the children, it's just shocking. Stephen said, so if your charges was dropped, do you still fight for your child in custody or not? Okay, I guess that's the question for Mary. Okay. Miranda said Stockholm syndrome. Okay. Okay, David Bentley said, I went to publicly known experts and asked them for contacts in my area. Qualified experts are expensive. The ones that I was referred to charge $225 per hour per child. So it takes money. It is unfortunately our breach for many targeted parents. I found no community-based experts, and even children's services have no one, and therefore can't protect children experiencing parental alienation abuse. Yeah, this is unfortunately a huge problem, and that is actually a strategy that alienators use, is trying to destroy you financially so that you're really not having the tools or the capability to fight. Really, they doing this very intentionally, a lot of them. So yeah, unfortunately, that's the situation. And when you deal with this, you need a lot of different type of expert. And I mean, for severe cases, to do this right, if you were to fight, you need a good lawyer, that's comfortable with litigation, that is experienced, but also like really understand parental alienation. You need an expert that understand parental alienation, and then you need an expert about false memories and suggestibility, and so many more. And then obviously, hopefully, you need a chance to reunite with your children. So you need a good reunification therapist. And it's shocking, Dr. Huffman. It's crazy. Like when I go into this field, it's such a huge problem. You're looking at 22 million parents in the U.S. alone, and our audience coming from all around the world. I mean, today I saw someone mention it from Australia, all around the world, and the number in the U.S. is 22 million parents, and yet we can't find enough experts. And I mean, you mentioned just a handful of experts, and we need so many. It's shocking. We just don't have the support system for this problem. It's crazy.
Well, and y'all know that the litigation, our court system is so antagonistic. It's so tough. And like when I was at Cornell, Steve Cece said that his greatest impact was in doing the research, because it can impact a lot of court cases. I mean, my work, I'm dealing with probably 16 cases at any one time. And so I'm making little impacts. It's like the person walking down the beach and they're throwing the starfish one at a time. And it's like, you can't get them all back in the water. It's like, yes, but it makes a difference to this one. And so we approach it different ways. And the colleagues that are doing, that are professors and publishing and testifying, it's a lot. It is really a lot. And there's a lot of professors that cross-examination is so grueling and so difficult. They're like, I don't need that. Like, there is no reason that I need to go into that hostile of an environment.
Yeah.
So, I mean, some of us are willing to do it, but unfortunately, the courtroom can be such a hostile environment. The last couple of times that I've testified, the judge has been very reasonable in letting me testify. The prosecutor has been very pleasant, asked great questions very appropriately, isn't attacking. And I'm not a biased witness. I mean, if there's question, I mean, I'm going to be very honest. I am there to educate the jury, and children can be telling the truth. I'm not going to stand up there and say, this child is definitely lying. I'll be like, here's the factors. There are a lot of factors of why this child may not be telling us what actually happened, even though they earnestly believe what they're telling is the truth. But there are kids who, despite all these factors, can still be telling the truth. But I would say that the courtroom can be such a hostile environment that is why a lot of experts, aren't, and as well as their impact being so small and, doing one case at a time. So you're right. I kind of keep a running list when I hear of people that are doing this, because I refer so many cases on. It is I love it because every case is so different. I'm not a detective, but I'm going, oh, where are the pieces? Every case is like new pieces of what different things are going to be applying, what different factors are coming in, from the age of the child to the relationship with everyone involved, whether they're siblings, what specifically the allegations are. I love what I do, but I can totally see why colleagues don't do this. So.
Yeah, I have parents that reach out to me a lot, and that's the same things that I feel, is that when I start to go into one case, it takes a lot to work on just one case. And it took so much time. And then I always think about it, how do I help more parents? And if I just take one or two cases, that take all of my time. And so that's why I have to turn down, because I can't do that. I want to help as many people as possible, and that's unfortunately that's the situation like you just talked about. And you mentioned Dr. Stephen Ceci a few times, and so I want to mention this to parents. He's an amazing expert in this field. We couldn't get an interview with him, but I highly recommend you searching on YouTube for. There's a couple of videos about his work, and it's just shocking in terms of like it's really shocking. It brings you to this sense of awareness about false allegation and false memory and suggestibility, and the malleability of the children memories. His work is just really groundbreaking, so definitely check out his work.
And his name is spelled Ceci, for those that want to look him up. Maggie Bruck, Bruck, is another amazing person to look up her work, and Deb Poole, Poole, and Michael Lamb. Those are some great people to find in their work. And then Cami London as well, spelled like the city, London, is another that I would recommend that people find. And obviously Elizabeth Loftus, we've talked about her several times as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and we have done interview with Dr. Loftus, so yeah, look out for our our videos on our Facebook page. On the videos tab, and you'll find that videos, and it's amazing work. And it's shocking even for us as for our audience as the victims, when they see this study, it's still shocking to them, because they couldn't explain themselves. They're going, why? My children know the truth. Why are they saying these things? But then when they hear this research outcome, it makes sense, but it's still like, you just still go, wow, it's seriously like, how easily it is, the children's memory being manipulated. It's really shocking. I know we're running out of time. I'm gonna just kind of scan quickly, see if I can see anything that and I know there's so many questions. I apologize, you guys. Okay. Yeah, this is kind of overwhelming. I'm sorry. There's so many questions. I don't know. So instead of doing the question, is there anything else, like any final thought that you wanted to add? I think maybe do that.
Not really. Just if there's any questions people have, if you saw anything else that seemed to kind of come out in quite a few questions, but yeah,
Okay.
it's absolutely a terrible situation. And there'll be cases that come across my desk that I'm like, how did this get to this point? Like, how in the world have these allegations gone this far with these bad of interviews, with this many discussions, therapy sessions? Like, why are we to the point where we are, where we're going to trial on this case? So,
Thank you.
it's work that needs to be done. And, being an expert requires so much flexibility, like I said earlier, that I just have to be able to drop everything and go into a court situation for 2 or 3 days. So, but you really don't have to have an expert if you have an attorney who's able to do a lot on cross-examination. And I will say, this book chapter that's coming out, I believe we have a whole section of questions of what you're trying to do on cross-examination with those witnesses.
Thank you. Okay, so I know quite a number of people asking for your contact information. Devin, I just messaged you, so respond to that. I know that Devin's asking for your contact information, and I'll connect you to. Okay, so I have an idea for you guys in our audience. I know like we have 126 comments or questions so far. So why don't we do this? You guys have any question or comments, keep adding into it. But what I'm looking for is, in the audience, could we have 1 or 2 parents volunteer to help me, because I can't do this myself. So if 1 or 2 of you guys are willing, please message me to volunteer to go through the list of questions. Let's export the question out and then categorize them. and then I would like to see some of the key and most relevant question out of the list of the questions so far, and then I will follow up with Dr. Huffman later, and then to get her response to those questions, and then we'll communicate that. Like, we wanted to pick a few questions that would be relevant to the most widest audience possible. So yeah, if you guys have more questions that we haven't addressed, please, post them. And then if I could please have one or two parents that would be willing to help me, going through the questions, really, I would appreciate it, because then we could help a lot of people. And I think that's what we're going to try to do from now on with the interviews, because it's really hard to pick up all the questions during the interview session. But Dr. Huffman, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your time and your help here. And it was very, very insightful. Thank you. And then for parents, if
You're
you guys are
welcome.
not already on our mailing list, please join our mailing list on our website, victim2hero.com. And also, we would love to get your support on Patreon. We are Victim2Hero on Patreon and also on Venmo. And yeah, follow our mailing list. We have a lot more events coming up. So thank you so much for your support, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you. Okay, I think it just ended. Thank